Okay, we're going to start looking at the reading from 1 Corinthians, and Margie Capeless is going to proclaim this reading for us from the Missal version, the New American Bibles. And be sure to write down any words or phrases or images that resonate with you while Margie's reading.
Brothers and sisters, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Okay, so what are some of the words, phrases, images that came to us while Margie was reading?
Foolishness of God.
Foolishness of God.
Proclaim Christ crucified.
Proclaim Christ crucified.
Greeks look for wisdom.
Greeks look for wisdom. Okay, I'll start with giving some background on Paul and Corinth. Paul founded the church at Corinth probably sometime between AD 50 and 52. In late AD 56 or early 57, he heard about problems at Corinth while he was in Ephesus, perhaps in prison there. Ephesus is in modern-day Western Turkey, so it's across the Aegean Sea from Corinth, which is in Greece. Some people from Chloe's house, so Chloe must have been a wealthy Corinthian woman whose house was big enough to house the church. Some people from Chloe's house brought Paul news about divisions within the community. Because he was not able to return to Corinth, Paul addressed the problem by letters. We have 2 letters of Paul to the Corinthians in the New Testament, and in the first one, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he mentions a previous letter that he had written to them, and this letter has not survived. So we have 2 letters of Paul to the Corinthians, but we know that he wrote more than that. So some background on the shame of the cross. For us, the cross is a religious symbol. It's sometimes used as a pendant on a piece of jewelry, or bishops wear a cross. Can you imagine beginning your prayers with the sign of the noose, or the sign of the electric chair? Okay, now I don't want to be irreverent, but that's the ancient equivalent of the sign of the cross. We do it without thinking. If you can imagine beginning, say, okay, we Catholics are going to begin our prayers with the sign of the electric chair. You can imagine the consternation that would cause. And so you can imagine the early Christians talking about a crucified Messiah, how that sounded in the ancient world. Now, the Old Testament and the Messiah, to understand this, many Christians have to unlearn a lot of catechetical oversimplification. When I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, I learned that people began to hope for the Messiah after Adam and Eve sinned. Here's some historical background. After Saul, that is after about 1000 BC, this is the first time that they had a Messiah, an anointed king. If you ask about the Messiah, Joe Israelite would have pointed you toward the locally reigning king. The reigning king was usually such a disappointment that eventually, after a couple centuries, prophets began to hope for an ideal king. They were hoping that the next king would be better. The Babylonians deposed the last reigning Jewish king in 586 BC when they destroyed Jerusalem. Eventually, the Persians, who conquered the Babylonians, allowed the Jews to return to their own country. Sometime after 500 BC, some Jews began to hope that the Davidic dynasty would be restored, that once again they would have a Messiah. However, the Persians preferred to have, the Persians preferred to have a high priest as the local ruler rather than a subject king. Originally, then, this hope was simply a hope that the Persians would change their policy and would allow the Jews to be ruled by a king instead of by a high priest. This Davidic king, this Messiah, would have been a subordinate king subject to the Persian emperor. It gradually became clear that this was not going to happen. The Persians were not going to change their policy. And so the hope starts to arise for a great Davidic ruler in the distant future. And this developed form of messianism, it arises very late in Old Testament times. There were other Jewish hopes for the future. Some hoped that the current system, that the high priest rulers would bring about God's will. This was the most conservative of all of the hopes. No radical changes were needed. We're doing fine. Everything is under control. So this was a very conservative hope for the future. Others hoped for a priestly Messiah. Well, this at least would be from the high priestly group. He could also be priestly Messiah. Some were hoping for two Messiahs. One priestly, he would have to come from the tribe of Levi, and a royal Messiah who would have to come from Judah, from the house of David. This is what the people at Qumran on the Dead Sea, they were hoping for two Messiahs. Some were hoping for a mysterious suffering servant. Sometimes the suffering servant is imagined as the whole Jewish people. The whole Jewish people is God's suffering servant. Sometimes it was imagined as a particular individual who would suffer vicariously for people, including the Jews. Others were hoping for a son of man who would judge the world. Usually son of man just means human being. But in Daniel chapter 7, the son of man, he's been having visions of heavenly beasts. And then there arise, most of these are evil. And then there arises one like a son of man, and he is the one that God gives dominion to and power and authority. Some were hoping that a son of man would come. Others were hoping for a prophet like Moses would arise. In Deuteronomy, it says, God will raise up for you a prophet like me. Some Jews thought that Joshua, his general of Moses, fulfilled that prophecy. Others thought that there would be a great future, a prophet like Moses. There is no suffering Messiah in the Old Testament. The Old Testament never portrays the Messiah as a figure who suffers. The only way you can have a suffering Messiah is if you imagine he is the same person as the suffering servant. Before Jesus, nobody ever imagined that these two very different figures, suffering servant and Messiah, would be the same person. In 2 Corinthians, the next letter he's going to write to the Corinthians, Paul says, all God's promises find their yes in him. Him is Jesus. So are you looking for a royal Messiah? That's Jesus. The Son of Man? That's Jesus. A prophet like Moses? Guess who? The priestly Messiah? Same one. The suffering servant? Ditto. God could have sent 4 or 5 different people to fulfill the promises of the Old Testament. This is hard for us Christians to understand because we read the Old Testament with 20/20 hindsight of what God actually did in Jesus before these promises were fulfilled in Jesus. We read of what God actually did, not as what the Old Testament meant before they were fulfilled in Jesus. Deuteronomy in chapter 21, the Hebrew says, for a hanged man is accursed by God. A tree is mentioned earlier in the verse, though not specifically in this phrase. The Greek Old Testament, I give you a long footnote as to why LXX means Greek Old Testament. The Greek Old Testament says, for anyone hanging on a tree is cursed by God. That's the NETS, the New English translation of the Septuagint translation. Paul alludes to this verse in Galatians. Cursed be, typo there, cursed be everyone hanged on a tree. When he was a pious Pharisee, the very idea that someone cursed by God could be the Messiah enraged Paul. That is why he persecuted the church. He considered the very idea of a crucified Messiah to be blasphemous, to be contra against the Old Testament. Now, Paul's call, we have a feast called the Conversion of Paul. Paul never refers to this experience as a conversion. He refers to it as a call. Using this language puts him in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets who were called by God. Paul had expected that if he ever saw Jesus, he would see him in hell. Paul's call involved a vision of Jesus Christ not being punished in hell, but in heaven, and not just in heaven, but at the right hand of God, sharing God's glory and throne. So Paul then repented. That's the New Testament idea of repent, is to change your mind. Paul repented. He changed his mind. If someone who had been crucified could be the Messiah, if someone who was crucified could be at the right hand of God, Paul needed to change everything he knew about Scripture. He needed to change his mind about how God acts in the world. Jews seek signs. These signs are not random miracles. Jews are looking for the signs of the Messianic age, where the lamb and the lion lie down together, okay? No Messianic age, no Messiah. It's that simple. The nations have not beaten their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. The world is still full of injustice, oppression, horrible diseases, and natural disasters. Paul would say that in spite of this, the power of God in Jesus Christ, in Messiah Jesus, is at work in this broken world, if we see it with eyes of faith. This is not obvious. It's a statement of faith. Immediately before our passage, Paul wrote, "It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe, those who accept the message with faith." Greeks seek wisdom. Evidently, some of the Corinthians wanted to stress the wisdom of the teachings of Jesus. They wanted to tone down Paul's emphasis on the cross. They thought that stressing the wisdom of Jesus would make Jesus more respectable. It would make converts easier. more people would join the church. The cross, as they saw it, was not essential to the message of the wise teacher, Jesus. The important thing about Jesus was not how he died, it was the wise things that he taught us. It was the cross was an unfortunate end to an otherwise successful career as a wise teacher. And as these people saw it, it was better not to overemphasize it. Paul's reaction, because of his personal experience, cursed is anyone who is hanged on a tree. Because of his personal experience of conversion and changing his mind, he reacts to this in the strongest terms possible about anyone de-emphasizing the cross. He doubles down on his emphasis on the centrality of the cross to the Christian message. If we want to see the action of God in our world, we have to begin with the horrific reality of the cross. The other night on the news, there were some pictures of people who had been most cruelly tortured in Syria. And even though the images were blurred, what I saw, it still haunts me. I couldn't hardly go to sleep that night. Paul would look at those images and say, God was there. Human wickedness cannot drive God out of our world. Human wickedness cannot drive God away even from a small part of our world. Christ crucified, Paul says, is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, it is just as hard for people to see God's power and wisdom in our broken world as it was for Paul to find a crucified Messiah as the will of God. Reading the Bible never convinced Paul of this. It was the power of God that changed his mind. It was a miracle. If we recognize God's power in the cross, it's because God has worked a miracle in our lives. Often Christians are puzzled why non-believers don't believe. The miracle is that anyone believes our foolish story, that anyone believes the folly that we Christians preach. If you bear the name Christian, it is because, like Paul, God has worked a miracle in your life. Your miracle might not be as dramatic as Paul's. It might not be as sudden. Sometimes changes happen over years or over decades so that we can never put our finger on the exact time or even the exact year when we changed our understanding. But if you bear the name of Christian, there is a miracle in your story somewhere. So at that point, I'll stop my input here, and any questions or comments or observations are welcome.
Did the use of the sign or the cross enter into?
Little louder, please, closer to the mic.
Okay. When did the use of the sign or the cross enter into the church?
I'm not sure. That's an excellent question, and you might be able to Google sign of the cross and find out. I read somewhere that Christian art, the cross was not depicted in Christian art in the first century, and the first crosses that were used in liturgical art were what we call glorious crucifixes. There was no body on the cross. It was just a cross with 4 jewels, or sometimes 5 jewels to represent the 5 wounds of Christ. But it's called a glorious crucifix. And and the crucifixes that portray a suffering Jesus are a later medieval development of Christianity. But I know the sign of the cross was early because the fathers in the 3rd and 4th century are teaching, but I don't know when it first began. I'd have to talk to a liturgist or a church historian. And I'm going to make myself a note. I'm a member of the Liturgy Network of the University of Notre Dame. If anyone has a master's degree in liturgy, they can get on there. And I might just say, hey, colleagues, I've got this question. Does anyone know what's the earliest reference to the sign of the cross? So if you've asked something that I want to know too, I'm going to see if I can find that out for you. Great question.
Father, I had one thing that kind of jumped out on me back when you were talking about Paul's reaction. If we want to see the action of God in our world, we have to begin with the horrific reality of the cross. And I got to thinking, if you go into virtually any church, any Catholic church, and look at the crucifix, it's not horrific. They tend to always have, I think, out of the idea of respect, have always made it, kind of glorified.
Uh-huh.
And the only exception I have seen to that is down at the cathedral in the museum they've got down there to the shroud. They have got a crucifix there that is more like what I imagined it probably really was. He's bleeding, he's dirty. It is really kind of horrific looking. And I think, as I say, that's the only one I've ever seen. All the rest of them, he's, pretty well groomed, and he's just like he's, almost like he's giving the blessing in that, like in church. And
That comes from the Gospel of John. That's John's portrait of the cross, a glorious crucifix. And some preachers think that the same sermon they give on Palm Sunday, which is the horrific cross, that it's suitable also for Good Friday. It's not, because Mark has a horrific crucifixion. John has a glorious crucifixion.
when I was in the Navy at Easter time, it was very interesting because the chapel served both Protestant and Catholic. And they had the crosses were on a pulley system where they could move them back and forth behind the curtain. So you could have either the bare cross or the crucifix.
I was an Air Force brat, and when we were on base, it would revolve. And so you could revolve the tabernacle around so it was gone, and you could revolve the crucifix around and it would be a cross.
This at Easter, just pull the curtains back so you had both side by side. You had the crucifix and then you had the empty cross. Quite impressive to me.
Right, yes. Any other thoughts? A couple more minutes before I need to start the next one.
Father, I think your comments that if you bear the name Christian, God has worked a miracle in your life.
Uh-huh.
I feel like a lot of us have been raised Christian. We spend our lives going to church and saying we're a Christian.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes sometimes some people that go to church never get that real miracle. When it comes to you, you know it. And it may take a long time. You may have it from early childhood, but everybody doesn't have it from early childhood. So even though they profess Christianity, they go to church, they do all these things, they really haven't gotten that miracle, at least that they're aware of.
What was someone asked a Jewish politician in Israel, how many Christians are there in Israel? And he said, well, if you're talking about people like Jesus who forgave their enemies and loved the ones who hated them, there might be a dozen. But if you're talking about the ones who go to churches, and then he gave however many it was, quite a few. Nazareth and Bethlehem are significant Christian towns, and I think Haifa, when I was there, I went to church and the Mass was in Polish, and there were a large amount of Polish immigrants who were, I guess they were like guest workers, and like many people who come over from Mexico and they work and they send the money back to Mexico. Well, these people were getting good wages in Israel and sending it back to Poland. This is back, I think, when there was still an Iron Curtain. Yeah. Okay.
Father, I just want to say about this this last section that you did about Christ crucified. The only thing I have to say is, wow, that really got me. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for your kind words. I'm going to stop this recording.